Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Um, I would like to start by thanking everyone that made this event possible. Thank you to our donor, the Swedish government. Thank you to the University of Pristina that's been a partner for this series of events. Thank you to the National Library for allowing us to use this great venue. Thank you to our colleagues at CHWB and to the technical staff. So for those that don't know about Heritage Space, we're a platform implemented by CHWB Kosovë. And we engage with the processes of the creation of meaning and value in the field of heritage. We work with researchers, artists, and cultural workers to encourage a bottom-up and experimental approach in the field of heritage. And tonight we've invited MayDay Rooms, which is a archive and educational platform in London. We've extended this invitation together with Pykë Presje, which is an independent platform and cultural space and bookstore in Prizren. They work mainly with printed matter and organize exhibitions, discursive programs, workshops that focus on radical histories, local histories, and people's movements, women's organizations, and class struggles. Heritage Space and Pykë Presje have started a collaboration this year, focusing on radical archives. We'll tell you more about it next year, which is pretty soon, actually. But I just wanted to tease this collaboration a little bit. I'll hand it over to Sezgin to introduce MayDay and Rosemary. But I would just like to thank MayDay for being here tonight and for the workshop that happened at the University of Pristina this morning. And yes, enjoy the talk.
We start the collaboration with Heritage Space. Dion already mentioned it will be, we hope, 20 years project involving a lot of bibliographies, studying legacies of certain cultural and intellectual institutions which was operating so during the Yugoslavian times, and looking at the contradictions and these complex networks of how the some knowledges are produced. So yes, and during this process, during this project, we will also have several, let's say, few public programs, and as a part of this, we propose to have a program with Rosemary Grennan Jan Gerber, who we work as Pykë Presje, and also me personally, I work because I have other projects, other, let's say, other initiatives dealing with the actualization of historical materials, sort of more critical approach to archives, trying to find more what we like to call a counter-archives, which is a different perspective to archives that you will very much hear from Rosemary's presentation, that are not state-based, that are not top-down, but more bottom-up or more grassroots understanding of archives or self-historization. Through this process, we also aim very much to criticize the existing conservative, nationalist, monolithic discourses and try to introduce more, let's say, perspectives that are both contemporary in form, but as well contemporary in policy. So dealing with past also means for us very much to engage with some discourses that is going on right now, today here, but elsewhere in the world. So it is really my pleasure that tonight we have Rosemary here presenting MayDay Rooms, a very interesting initiative in London that we have collaborated. I presented Rabra Press, another initiative, but also we have collaborated with Rosemary and Jan with a relatively new initiative in Berlin, which I suggest you to check, called Agit. Agit or Agit? How do you say? Agit?
However you wish.
However, yeah.
No.
Okay. So the Agit is a relatively new space, which also posts some exhibitions, very much involved in digitalizations of like archival materials. We had an event. I had a small residency in spring, which was very, very engaging, I would say, with a lot of other peoples in Berlin, which today goes, as you might know, through a very difficult circumstances, the cultural climate in Berlin. So, and Agit, I would say, stands in a front of this like dynamics, as well as MayDay Rooms. So I'm really happy to introduce very briefly. I don't want to make like CV introduction, but because your presentation will be about MayDay Rooms, which and expanding to some other topics that are related to others. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the invite and to be here. And I don't think I've ever presented such a beautiful room. So yes. So yes, I'm from MayDay Rooms. It's not, I should stress that it's not just me at MayDay Rooms. There's 4 of us who work there part-time. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting We All Do Together. So I'm going to repeat myself a little bit from the workshop this morning, but hopefully go into more details about other things. Should emphasize that MayDay Rooms is very London-based, but hopefully there'll be some bits from our practice that can be useful to Pristina or like Kosovo wider. So the presentation is called Archiving from Below, or MayDay Rooms in 5 documents. And I wanted to start with a quote from our manifesto, which is not usually used that much anymore, but it was written by the founding members of MayDay Rooms in 2011. And it says, "The surviving documents of our collective past have come down to us in shards and fragments, mostly by chance. This is especially true of the material traces from history from below, and it's very rare that conscious and systematic efforts are initiated to protect the archives of descent from loss and erasure." And so this sort of sets up this idea of what we call history from below, and I'm going to talk a bit about how our archival practice, which we often call archiving from below, comes out of this idea. And also, in keeping with these shards and fragments of the documents of our collective past, I'm going to be framing them through a series of documents that we hold at MayDay Rooms as well. And I must stress that it's very much, these documents are not about, it's not going to be about those documents, but these are sort of starting points in order to have highlight particular areas. So the first document is called NEPA News. And NEPA News stands for the Voice of New England Prisoner Association. These are newspapers with articles mainly written from prisoners themselves, along with people involved in radical history and what was called militant pedagogy. And it publicizes the struggles against the oppressive regime of the US prison system. And it was published between 1973 and 1975. And it was donated to MayDay Rooms by the historian Peter Limbauer, who was an ex-member of the NEPA News collective. So MayDay Rooms started with a number of unboxing events at somewhere called the Marx Memorial Library in London. There were 3 founding depositors of MayDay Rooms, George Gafensis, Sylvia Federici, and Peter Leinbauer. Each addressed one of these unboxing events, which you can also see up here. Each addressed the different foundational collections of MayDay Rooms, which was Wages for Housework, Midnight Notes Journal, and NEPA News, which I mentioned. So Peter Leinbauer kind of opens a suitcase which has all the material inside as well. And so he opens the suitcase to reveal several archive boxes. He likens them to sort of a Pandora's box in which different fragments and past dramas of the past fly out of. However, he kind of comments, and this is again the start of MayDay's ongoing practice, that MayDay's commitment to collaboratively work on archives alleviates the burden of those handing over that material from being the sole responsibility of these histories, and thus orientating the history towards future organising. And from these three modest collections, the MayDay Rooms archive has grown to over 100,000 items, over 2,000 film and video, and a digital archive of over 19,000 digitizations. And you can see some I've tried to do an overview of some of the the themes of our collections. So the collections focus on social struggle, radical art, the acts of resistance from the 1960s to the present. It contains everything from recent feminist poetry to 1990s techno ephemera, from situationist magazines to the history of riots and industrial transformations, from 1970s educational experiments to prison writings. Some of our depositors bring a few pamphlets that were found under their bed or in the corner of their cupboards. Often, others bring great volumes of material revealing the traces of a life lived in struggle. This approach, as said in the manifesto, is necessarily fragmented and contingent, and speaks to the fact that archives of radical politics have seldom been systematically assembled. And our work very much proceeds from the understanding that social change can most effectively happen when marginalised and oppressed groups get to know their own histories from below. And our archival practice and organisational structure reflects this. And just briefly going back to history from below, I'm not sure if people are aware of the historian Marcus Rediker, who wrote a book called, with Peter Leinbauer, called The Many-Headed Hydra, most famously. And so he describes history from below. And he says it's a variety of social history that emerges from the new left to explore the experiences and history-making hour of working people who have long been left out of an elite top-down historical narrative. It is an approach to the past that concentrates not only on the traditional subjects of histories, not kings, the president, the philosophers, ordinary working people who simply for what they experienced in the past, but for their ability to shape the way that history happens. And I'm going to also go on to another quote, trying to sort of define this relationship between this approach to history and how one might build an archival practice with that in mind. So Peter Leinbauer, in his complete, true, authentic, and wonderful history of MayDay, is a series of essays about International Workers' Day. He includes a chapter called Archiving at the MayDay Rooms. And he says, in our day, the traces of our radical movements are being thrown into rubbish pits as state-sponsored austerity demands the commodification of every inch of space, and in which sinister intent destroys the evidence of our past, its joys, its victory. Clear out the closets, empty the shelves, toss out the old footage, shred the underground press, pulverize the brittle yellowing documents. Thus, neoliberalism organizes the transition from old to new. And they must silence alternatives. And he's referring to now George Jackson, who was a prominent figure in the Black Power movement and prison organizing, who died in 1971. He says, "We do not want the voice of George Jackson to be silenced. His words still eloquently describe a desirable and a necessary program." And so this, in a way, is the core work of MayDay Rooms. It's an idea that the past archive material or social movements do not come to MayDay Rooms to be confined to history, but we have a remit to very much make them a resource and relevant and a tool for organising in the present as well. And it's interesting to think of how many ways of organising, tactics, histories of struggle are easily forgotten. And again, as he's saying, we do not want the voice of George Jackson to be silenced. And this relationship between past and historical material and present day struggle with a sort of future orientation, we've often called this as something called activation. And this is done through many of our different principles of archiving, which is very much an active practice, I would say, and not something that we came up with these principles and now we apply them, and now that relationship between past and present has been kind of confirmed. So here's a few examples of what we would say history is a tool for change and that archives should be future orientated. So these are different activities we've done with the Cleaners Union. We've taken the archive to picket lines to make a little line of archive, which were actually photocopies, if anyone is worried about preservation. And then this is an archive that I've been quite involved in building, which is called the Troops Out movement, which was an campaign to get British troops out of the north of Ireland. And here's a discussion that we had with some of the founding members and of the Troops Out movement as well. So we really try and link up current social movement groups to the collections that we are collecting as well. And say in the example of the Troops Out movement, Northern Ireland is arguably like one of Britain's ongoing colonial projects. However, if you were to talk to many people in the UK, they would have absolutely no idea what was going on. And so this comes to our second point, which is that all resistance comes from the liberation of memory. And this goes with what Sezgin was saying about the sort of creeping historical revisionism that we can see, especially with the rise of the right, and how these archives can stand as documents against that as well. We mainly collect things that are what I would call a sort of anti-authoritarian left. So we don't collect political parties, we don't collect, say, official trade unions, we collect more social movement, grassroots material. However, we try to be non-sectarian about that as well. We're quite partisan, we're very political, but we are not, we try not to be sectarian. None of us at MayDay Rooms are trained, and we really try to find ways to collectively work on archives, and we open out the archiving process to anyone who wants to get involved, really. So here are some examples of things like scanathons that we've done, or like collective cataloguing processes. And we try and work on principles of like non-hierarchy and sort of not the exercisation of particular experts. Another way that we try and bring this material out into kind of wider audiences is that we have a sort of very extensive ongoing youth program, which might get 16 to 25-year-olds involved in different archival processes. Here you can see ones around radical housing movements, oral history training. Yeah. And I can talk about that a bit maybe later if anyone's interested. I don't want to go into too much detail now. And then our other, one of our main principles is the idea of the primacy of use. So this is the idea that those archives should be there, they should be handled, they should be reused, they should be published, they should be circulated. And this in itself is a way of assuring their survival. And that's actually sometimes a bit of an antithesis of what you think an archive is. You think an archive is that we keep them in the cupboard and temperature control cupboard and like don't let people handle them. And I'll speak a bit about this later, but our idea is that they should be used, they were part of struggle, and they should remain part of. So this brings me on to my second document, And I chose this one because these two, which come from the same collection of Midnight Notes. So Midnight Notes was a US-based collective which published a journal called Midnight Notes in 1979. And they really deal a lot with the idea of the commons as a kind of political frontier. Probably not frontier of commons. Anyway, a political front, let's say. And so this is a folder from the Midnight Notes archive, which has documents in them, and it just says, beware the enclosures. And then this looks at sort of new enclosures. And so I wanted to highlight the sort of the context from this document. I wanted to highlight the context in which MayDay Rooms was established. So it was established in the context of brutal austerity cuts that happened in Britain to public services from 2010 onwards with the Conservative government. And this saw the closure of many community libraries, public libraries, community centres and cultural spaces. And this was actually combined with another law which prohibited the squatting of buildings, which a lot of social movements, social centres came out of as well. And this really resulted in the loss of social and communal spaces, which had often acted, as we saw it, the container for cultural memory and its history. And within this context of increasing loss and destruction, there was a kind of, I didn't found MayDay, but I'm sort of paraphrasing the founders. There was a real kind of commitment to not just having a digital archive or a small collection, but a social space in which is dedicated to safeguarding these histories, but also a space in which new struggles can continue. And so this is our building, which is quite a nice big building on Fleet Street in the middle of the city of London. And Fleet Street is famous for being the historical centre of print culture in Britain since the 16th century. From the Chartists to seditious printing and distribution, Thomas Paine first finishes The Rights of Man there, goes to the pub next door to MayDay, gets drunk, leaves it behind, has to come back in the morning. But all the way up to the centre of the British newspaper industry until 1986, when Rupert Murdoch broke the printers' unions in the Wapping dispute. And so we were able, with the help of a trust, to move into this building. We don't own it, but we don't pay any rent. And we really tried to make this a sort of symbol of urgent resistance in a context where we're surrounded by sort of towers of luxury flats and bankers and lawyers and speculative real estate. And this kind of brings us on to the meaning of the name. So MayDay Rooms is obviously International Workers' Day, but it's also the International Distress Signal. And both of these sort of express the urgency of things that are happening to radical heritage in light of these enclosures of particular spaces of resistance in London as well. And the rooms are, because there are a lot of rooms, but also that these rooms are multifunctioning. So like one floor of MayDay Rooms is archive, and the rest is other political initiatives, trade unions, sort of rights campaigns, different publications. We have groups doing Palestinian solidarity. We have a lot of different social movement groups that run out of MayDay Rooms. And it was the idea that these histories of social struggle and contemporary organising should not sit apart from each other, but should be seen as a kind of continuation, or at least a connection as well. And so this was, again, this idea of like resisting this enclosure of both collective memory and radical spaces as well. And there's some pictures of things going on at MayDay Rooms, which are not all to do with archives as well. So this brings me on to our third document, which is called Agitprop Notes, which is actually also the name of one of our publications, which you're welcome to have a look at the end. So Agitprop Notes was published by a group called Big Flame, who are a socialist, revolutionary socialist feminist organisation who came out of Liverpool in the 1970s. And they ran a monthly newspaper, and they had 5 different basic points of their program, which was building political practice based on the mass working class, not merely a representative layer, combating reformism, the social factory, class first, party second, on the autonomy of each specifically oppressed sector, and a non-sectarian, non-authoritarian political method. And so very much in that was also a kind of almost like DIY autonomous principle, which this pamphlet comes out of. And it's a pamphlet that teaches you how to print, basically. So got a very exciting title called Getting the Best Out of Your Duplicator. But it also teaches you how to, you can see within the fist, it's printing, it's also how to run a creche. It's also how to do a speech. It's how to make leaflets. And so it's this kind of like tools of that kind of more autonomous organizing of the time. But I really wanted to pick up on the sort of print collection, print idea as well. And so much of MayDay Rooms' material was produced during the eruption of radical print culture in the 1970s, which saw political and social movement groups take up new, accessible and affordable offset litho screen printing duplication technologies to produce leaflets, newspapers, flyers, comic books, positioning papers, all in the aids of struggle. And so thousands of pages were cranked out of these devices and often produced in haste, meant to mobilize outwardly and not to be kept. They covered strike actions, liberation campaigns, local groups, upcoming actions, and few were individually authored, instead using collective names, pseudonyms, or published anonymously. And print here was like very much a means of communicating widely with the means available to groups at the time. And they became sort of an integral way of organizations and collectives constituting themselves as well. And this here is a manual called like Rolling Your Own, which was about feminist printers in the 1970s. And again, this sort of manual of how to print. And then in terms of that description of ephemera, I've bought some material as well. So if anyone wants to have a look at it at the end, but equally you can see these are posters, newspapers, photographs, small bulletins, things like that. And so this is really the material traces of these struggles that MayDay Rooms collects. And we really wanted to think through what it means to archive these things that weren't meant to be kept, that were not like a book or a film or a sort of discrete object. And it's quite interesting to think about them in relation to other kind of archival or historical items such as books and publication, more kind of formal publications. And I wanted to quote the work of Jess Baines and Nick Soburn here, which have written about this idea of socialist objects to describe biblical print production. And so this is what Baines calls, in contrast to the sedated and finished thing of bourgeois commodity culture, the socialist object is a co-worker that sort of enriches the politics of that political struggle. And so we really think about that when we're very kind of aware of the world of a political ephemera. But I sort of mention these relationships because we've tried to also think about what that means in a digital platforms as well. And so this is our digital archive, which is called Leftovers, which, as I said in the workshop, is a bad pun on left-wing ephemera. And it is not actually just, it's a collaborative platform which uses a software called Pandora, which Jan, who's in the audience, produced. And it looks at the different ways that we can think of these political ephemeras as digital objects and try and build on the kind of political relationships that MayDay does, archiving print ephemera in the building into a digital space as well. And so currently we have around 19,000 objects. They're scans of the original documents and they're all fully word searchable. So you can type at the top rent strike and it will come up with everything that mentions rent strike as well. And you can also we also came up with different sorts of ideas of metadata. Usually metadata is a sort of abstraction of the object. It's data about the object, but you cannot really get to the object itself. So you're able to like download all of the material on leftovers, and you're also able to, we have new different types of metadata categories such as tactic. And you can click on those tactics and it will come up with different ways of organizing as well. And you can see graphical representations of those documents as well. And we also draw we would call leftovers an archive of archives. It's our scans, but then we bring in scans from other archives as well. And this was a particular example of that, which is the Black Panther Party paper, which was just sent to us as a Google file. Don't know who sent it. Someone scanned it all. We OCR'd it and put it into leftovers. Equally, this is an example of a women's liberation magazine called Spare Rib, which, well, I didn't, but Jan data scraped from the British Library. So we take stuff from all sources. So if anyone wants to actually contribute to leftovers, has any scans, you're very welcome to as well. We also work with just smaller online archives of kind of, I suppose, leftist nerds who have digitized their material. And actually, it's a kind of way of us helping to back up things, put these documents in relation to each other, and it always relates back to the source that we got them from. So although it seems like an act of centralization, it's a real attempt at a sort of shared and networked platform of this kind of material as well. Where you can see this is a publisher called Red Notes, who we hold a lot of their material. This is about the hot autumn in Italy in 1977. And here we have things like rent strike, refusal of work. These are all sort of tactics that we think reorientates the digital archive rather than being a static repository as a tool for social struggle. Okay, so document 4. And actually I have some copies of these here as well, so you can have a look at them. So document 4 is something called The Work of Photographer. There's actually only 3 volumes of this, and it was published in 1978 by a photographer called Terry Dennett, who I think most famously was married to the famous feminist photographer Jo Spence, if anyone has heard of her. And so he himself does this archival research that we have at MayDay Rooms into the film and photography leagues of the 1920s and 30s, most big in Germany, but also there was a branch in Britain, Belgium, quite a lot, I think in America as well. And so he sort of revives this history of the work of photography movement and starts reissuing the work of photographer. And this particular issue is the history of that movement. Then there's a documentation of the strikes that are happening at Fort Dagenham at the time, and then again in the spirit of this sort of like DIY culture, how to make your own agitprop slideshow. So MayDay Rooms was founded on the idea that radical archiving should be an outward-facing process, and it should promote distribution, accessibility, and use, rather than, as I said, being a static repository. And I also want to sort of talk about an archive briefly in New York called Interference Archive, who has also argued that the use of these political documents is itself a form of preservation. Project that we talked about in the workshop, which Jan has been involved in, called PADMA, Public Access Digital Media Archive, also came up with 10 theses of archiving, which I recommend you have a look. And they come up with this great section where they say, Henry Langlois, the founder of the Cinémathèque Française, stated that the best way to preserve a film is to project it. And he sort of hints here at the very opposite philosophy of archiving, to actually use and consume a thing, to keep it, to bring it into circulation, to literally throw them forth into a shared and distributed process that operates based on diffusion, non-consolidation, through imagination, not memory, towards creation, not conservation. And I was saying in the workshop earlier that Terry Dennett's also maybe goes away from this kind of collecting and sort of representative approach of archiving when he says he comes up with the question, photography for the workers or workers' photography. And it changes this idea of, rather than photography or this archiving process being representative, it actually becomes a tool of those workers themselves or of those kind of histories themselves. And here we go from this slideshow to a bulletin that was made during the strikes in Dagenham, in which you can see these photographs being cut up and then republished as part of the strike bulletin as well. And here you go. This is again his question. And this question comes directly out of the Film and Photography Leagues of the 1930s, which says film is a weapon, use it. And again, so these are kind of questions that this political history is already talking about, and this we feel is very important for that kind of archival principles as well. Another group that really used that was something called Cinema Action. Quite a lot of their films are online. They're very interesting as well. But again, this was about use and consumption of this stuff, not necessarily just in a cinema, but they highly distributed it amongst factories, through dock strikes and things like that. Here we have the Ford Workers show where they would also be showing some of these films as well. And then the final document is a bit of a document that I'm very interested in, which is a document describing an archive from 1973 that is almost exactly the same as MayDay Rooms, which no longer exists, and there is very little trace of that. And so MayDay Rooms is not the first of its kind, and nor will it be the last, as we can see with this document. And this has the same address as a bookshop that was quite famous bookshop called Rising Free, but this is the only record that I found of public library. However, more recently, I found out that one of the advisory boards of MayDay Rooms, Anna Davin, who was integral in setting up the History Workshop project, was actually involved in the creation of this library, but had not mentioned it. And so you can see the relationship between Anna Davin was also involved in things like Shroom. She was involved in the women's liberation workshop movement. She was also involved in the History Workshop, which I said this quote in the workshop and everyone seemed to like it. So you can say it again. And it says, only by seeking and recognizing the political relevance in history that we can bring it more directly into the battle for ideas. History is too important to be left just to the professional historians. And so, again, this is this kind of relationship that these archives are not people who are not separated from those struggles. They're made by the people who are involved in them as well. And you can see that. And the same with this approach to history as well. And so I'm actually now, having read that she was involved in this, I'm going to maybe try and interview her a bit about it as well. And I think in this approach, where archives become resources for struggle, they become part of that collective history, that they can become counter-organizations to dominant narratives as well. Because within this archival turn in both arts and academia, there are many projects that are focused on the critique of archival practices and reconceptualizing what it means to archiving. But simply critiquing the archive does not build long-term sustainable counter-organizations that resist these dominant narratives and rethinks the ways that we learn from the past. So you could put this material in, say, the British Library, but it doesn't do the same thing as perhaps it does at MayDay Rooms. And I think that's where I'll stop. That's thank you. I've been thinking like Jesse. People that do. And just to say afterwards, I bought all of our publications. There's also a few posters left over from the workshop, which are the Wages for Housework posters that are reproductions. I'm not just giving away the archives. And then we like use, but we're not like you can spill things on them and steal them. But and then there's some more material as well. So maybe you just get an idea of the kind of materials that we've been
There. You don't need to have a white gloves. No, these materials.
To think.
But Rosemary, it's really interesting. I hope for all of you. And of course, like what I would like to start to maybe open up this discussion is that statement you just finished with. That history is too important to be left just to the professional historian. Really, this is like a slogan, and I understand that also drives your methodology, but especially your ethics. You know, because this is like a history which is done with an attachment, with a quite even including emotional attachment that is like all that subjectivity tools. One important thread that you didn't mention, but I think we should open here because in Kosovo is a quite important practice. It's an oral history.
Okay.
How did oral history practices play a role in building these archives? Because most of this left is critical, let's say, a non-state from below archives, in fact, are initiatives of oral histories. Let's say, some of the archives that I know dealing with the Spanish Civil War, in fact, started with discussing and talking, hearing the voices of people who were part of the struggles. So, what is your position? And what is your position as a MayDay Rooms about oral history?
I don't know if we have a position. We have just set up a sort of recording. I don't know if studio is the word because it's not very soundproof, but we've got some recording equipment at MayDay Rooms where we're going to try and start doing more informal oral histories, I suppose. But one of the things that we have done from the beginning is keep quite a sort of active relationship with the depositors MayDay Rooms, and this has facilitated quite a lot of like intergenerational conversations, and a lot of them have sort of recorded more testimonies when positing that material as well. So this is like maybe less a kind of official oral history methodology, but something that is kind of important to sort of locate that collection as well, because often the people who donate that stuff aren't the people who produced it as well. So, you know, you go to a protest and you might get a leaflet and then you keep it. It's not that it's yours, but again, they can contextualize their own collection. Sometimes they have been incredibly involved in that production as well. And also that's very useful for us as well. But we're starting to do more oral history. Particularly, we're kind of privileged, I suppose, because it's such a post-war, like from 1968 onwards, that actually most people are alive. So you can also do that as well. But I wouldn't say it was central to the formation of MayDay, but it's something that, again, became very much part of this like history from below, history workshop kind of movement as well. Like the kind of, I suppose also with recording equipment as well, it became very integral to that approach to history as well. So yeah, we want to do a bit more of that as well.
So, and the history from below, when we have the approach to historical materials from that perspective, also it's like quite challenging to how we understand the nationalism question of the nation, you know, because generally the big state archives are constructed so it will reproduce the national belonging, you know. So do you think that this history from below is challenging that, or is it too utopistic to claim that for the archival work, you know?
I mean, yeah, I think I think I've said before, like I don't think that these bigger institutions shouldn't exist. I think it's very good to have like a critical dialogue with them. I don't think everyone should just necessarily be going around with, I don't know, like the Magna Carta in Britain, just like handling it. But I think that these, again, this can inform that. And also, I think it's quite an autonomous archive as well, right? So it's not necessarily interested in becoming part of that national collection as well. So, yeah. But no, I think that's why I said at the end, in a way, like, archives archives in Britain for sure are opening themselves out to collect this material. You can see that with the things like the digitization of spare rib, but it's not doing the same thing as MayDay Rooms is doing with trying to kind of build this sort of political memory behind current sort of politics.
Yeah.
It's a sort of maybe more of a like when I said, oh, movements don't come to MayDay to be confined to history. In a way, they probably do go to the National Archive to be confined to history. And so, again, that's how you approach that material.
I am sure many people have questions, but just some, apart from this theoretical, conceptual discussions, like practical side is also very important.
Yes.
To know, for example, like how do you assist to people who enter to your institution, to your archive, to your collection? Because it's a huge, you said like 100,000 items.
Yeah, some of those are just like bits of paper though. So you're on like 100,000,
it can be something just the paper. So like, what is your relationship to people who come to use the archive? Like how do you if this idea, because this history from below doesn't happen by itself. It needs some extra effort, because easily what is my, let's say, also can be and many other people can experience that it can go to fetishization, because it's not all documents fragile and designed much better, printed in a different techniques like silk screen, lino cut, whatever, So how to make the distance to these materials which are historical, but to play a role of let's say an intellectual, political activity.
Yeah. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking to the people who come to the archive. People don't come with like very specific requests. People are generally interested in like an area, or they're doing some campaign, or some researchers much more specific, but still not on the level of like, I would like to look at this one document. It's very much a kind of social interaction. And we run a big program as well for people who don't necessarily know how to get into the archive. So we look at the histories of these documents in different like public events, things like this, working groups. But in terms of people just coming and being like in love with the materiality and not the kind of critical function, is this what you mean in terms of?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's an occupational hazard of working in an archive of nice pamphlets. Luckily, we have a like print working group that are quite critical of like working through what the importance of that materiality is outside of pure aesthetics. So like, what is the political function? I kind of alluded to a bit. What's that kind of printing function as well? But I think in terms of our audience, you don't have to sign in. You don't have to book an appointment. You're not allowed to bill things on it. That's basically the rule. You often get given a big box, and then you can just like look through it, and then you can make your own associations with it. People come for very different reasons as well. And so it's a bit of a cop out of the question, but I think it really varies about like what people are doing as well. But in terms of how we try to promote that material and how we try to build that kind of communities of interest around it, that often tries to be like collective but critical.
Yeah, and also the way that you are sometimes part of like some sort of like a union activism, or like in picketing you are distributing the pamphlets, and even the fact that you brought some here that people can look. This is already like opening up the documents from the sanctuary.
Yes,
because that's the most annoying part with the archives.
Yeah,
if you go and see like an abstract some like metadata of like what is there, and you cannot even
get to the object.
Get to the object. So yeah,
and we do try and like particularly say like the youth program, like bring archives into community centres, or again making picket lines out of them, or we recently have started a collaboration with a magazine called Dose Magazine, which is it's produced and then distributed for no cost to homeless people on the street, and then they sell it and to make money basically. And so this has a circulation of 35,000. And so we have one which reproduces the archive material and then talks about the history of the claimants' unions. And so this is great. This is exciting. 30 years. And like the editorial line of this magazine, I suppose it's quite anarchist, but you're not allowed to use like political jargon. It's got to be understandable for the person who buys it on the bus.
Yeah, they're selling trams, trains. I go to very nice, like maybe close. I was a newspaper.
And that will come out soon, and that will be our first one. And then we will do a regular feature of different archives and stuff. So we're always thinking of different ways to do this and explore those relationships. And I think that's why we don't have like yet a set manifesto. Well, I know it said it was from the manifesto, but it's not really a manifesto. But like it's an active relationship between history and kind of present struggle that we really try to always probe.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, please, I'm sure you have some questions, comments you want to relate. Of course here, we today during the workshop, we spoke also about our local, problems with archives and in a way, because the problem in this post-socialist countries that's in transition, let's say the archives are in total chaos. So already to call for organized state archives is an activism.
Yeah.
But it's let's have a good state archive is a step to make first. But what is to call for the archives from below? It's almost like a fantasy. But in some ways we are, I think, more advanced to engage with the archives from below. Because the state archives is in such a disarray, and in people mostly academicians, historians, or artists have a total disbelief to the state archives.
Yeah.
So each person's initiatives are bringing their kind of more improvised archives. That is as a lot of positive impact to building a discourse, but also it's quite a lot of things has been done over and over, to repeat it. And it's So this, maybe we can open these questions, ethics. Yeah.
Just to say on that point, which going back to this Kapler's 10 thesis of the archive, which I think
that was great. Yeah, with Henry Langlois.
Yeah. And it's a great and fun document, although quite wildly conceptual. But one of them is, I'm looking at Jan because he was part of it. One is called Don't Wait for the Archive. It's it's not someone's not going to do it for you. And you can still demand for a state collection and preservation, and you could still do something that was a bit more like MayDay Rooms. I think this it's maybe a false, I know it's called a counter-institution or a counter-archive, but I think sometimes this is a false separation as well. And also that the state archive is necessarily always a repress.
But also there's a poetic statement of Henry Langlois, who is the founder of cinema.
Yeah.
The way of preserving film is to project.
It is great.
It's amazing. Yeah.
It's true, in a way. If you can't see them, no one remembers them.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have a question? Thank you, Rosemary. Today we were also talking about even though they are very local materials, I think you said that there is an internationalist kind of thing in those materials also. And it's really how you tell MayDay is the local activism, union activism is organic part of this. That's how these materials are being collected at the same time. But there are also, there is a kind of, if I would look from that side, I would think this archive would be really concentrated on a local British social movements, so to say. But there were also other materials that you showed, Italian workers tradition, these journals, and I guess maybe this also kind of coincidence, because you told in the beginning Silvia Pede, she was one of the donors, and I wanted to ask you what is the can you give an overview of literature in MayDay that are either from other parts of the world, maybe from Balkan? Is there any? Yeah.
So I suppose one thing is the left is always internationalist in a way. Often, it's not always, but yeah. So
It should be.
be internationalist. So even if that campaign is in Britain, it's out with this reporting. Like there's. I think this is why it's also quite interesting to look at these massive print networks that these things come out of, is because actually you're like, how did they get all of that information from all over the world to go into like this kind of these pamphlets as well? So you were talking about this local press, Hackney Radical Press, which is a small borough in London, which is talking about
Right in about 1930s, for example.
it has a big kind of overview as well. So because our archive represents very particular political tendency, which is not that big in Britain, it's much bigger in this like Italy, or like this kind of more autonomous workerist perspective, that we have a lot of material from around the world that kind of has that as well. So we have a lot of Italian material, which came from someone who donated a lot of material, who was Antonio Negri's translator. And so, yeah, there's lots of different routes by which that arrives, although we have things like a whole run of something that's called Peace News, which reports on every kind of like anti-war movement, anti-militarization stuff from the 1936, and it just finished as a publication a couple of months ago. And so this long time, yeah, just and it's like and so yeah, this reports on almost like every kind of conflict zone in the world as well. And so that's produced in London, very kind of global in its perspective. We have things like the Latin American Workers Association, which then became one of the unions that is now at MayDay Rooms, again based in London, very international, Spanish language, this kind of thing as well. You guys you republished E.P. Thompson on Yugoslavia?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. So again, this is like this history from below perspective.
Yeah, E.P. Thompson actually is a crucial, who, as a kind of like a major historian, we introduced that history that is deserved to be written, and it's worth to be written, is the people's history. And what is the case in that approach? Maybe to open up a little bit, because for Marxism, for leftist historiography, that was important, was always made from the position of workers. But here is a history from the position of peasants. Because the peasants didn't have their own, let's say, historization. They were not part of the institutions. They were not like writing about. There was not an intellectual production, but still there was a lot of thoughts about organization and stuff. So yeah, this has a big repercussions in a way.
And I mean, and that's why also this kind of archiving from below, like the material traces of that history are, pamphlets that are produced in those campaigns, but also like court records, poetry, like intellectual, like that kind of production that is not necessarily someone very fully documenting their own struggles and something. So, I mean, E.P. Thompson uses a lot of poetry.
What did you get from Silvia Federici? What was the archive?
It's actually weirdly mainly material from New York. Although there is stuff from the Wages for Housework campaign in Padua, and it's the Wages for Housework campaign.
Yeah.
So it's their leaflets. There's some of their scrapbooks, poster over there of their demands. It's mainly like pamphlets, leaflets, posters that they've kind of created, and then some internal documents, and then series of like press clippings. And it's not a huge collection actually, but it's
a symbolic.
It really punches above its weight. Yeah, it's one of our most requested collections as well. So yeah.
So more questions.
Looking for. Yeah,
One more.
Publications. Are those publications that MayDay Room did? Yeah, I wanted to know more about that, and because the way that you reactivate this material from a more editorial point of view and your research strategy from within, like beyond the workshops that you do and bringing the material outside. But yeah, I wanted to know more about your own like research strategy and how you decide what to focus on, and just the editorial perspective.
So one of the ones here, which is about the Anti-University of London, was done before my time at MayDay. So it was done before we even got a building. And so that was a commission, but I can't really speak to that. These two pamphlets, we call them pamphlets, but they're definitely books by now. They came from open calls. So we try and do quite a lot of like open calls, which have, I mean, people are critical of that because of the kind of competitive element, but in a way, it's a way of opening out that. And so we asked for a very open call saying like, we want to do publications of things that kind of use the archive as a starting point to say something about the present, very open in format. And then we got a lot, and then we grouped them together. So that's actually why these are these themes, because those submissions spoke to that. So, however, we will do, and we have a group in the building that is called Therapy, which comes out of this pamphlet here, which is also by Big Claim, which is a kind of anti-psychiatry movement. And so we're gonna edit a thing on like a pamphlet on this next. We're also doing a big project around trying to reframe peace movement from looking at questions of violence and non-violence, how demilitarization campaigns kind of have intersected with liberation struggles, looking at like diversities of tactics, different like roles of like underrepresented people in the peace movement, and that will be a big exhibition in next year, and then there will be another publication that comes out of that as well. So, I mean, we work as a collective. We're like non-hierarchical. Anyone can kind of bring something to the table. We all don't politically agree in a way. I mean, we're all no one's right wing, but do you know what I mean? Like when within this wide spectrum of the left, we don't all agree, and so that's quite nice that people can also kind of pursue those kind of commitments, things like that. And so it's not we don't have a strict editorial line. Yeah, we have arguments. We have been having a long argument about different types of font, which actually you can't. It's just aesthetics. You can't actually reconcile that, right?
Font is also a very ideological question.
Yeah.
So we have one more question here. So we wanted to ask, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your lecture. So I wanted to ask because you're talking about archiving from below, and I feel like archiving and research work and cultural work here is very much related to public funding here in Kosovo. And so it's basically kind of this entity that we have to work around, work with, kind of adapt our research to.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a bit of a boring question, but like I was really interested in how MayDay works in this regard, and not like to give us inspiration now, but I feel like for a lot of researchers it can be a bit not demanding, but you always have this in the back of your mind that what you're trying to archive and to research is going through a funnel in some way or another. And I was just interested in your opinion on this, basically. How does MayDay function in this aspect, or like what are some problems you've kind of encountered and things like this?
So we're in quite a lucky position where we have a trust that funds our wages and also bought the building, so we don't pay any rent, although we don't own the building. So obviously that's great. but we then do fundraise for projects as well. And so some of it's cynical and some of it is something that we can kind of make, like that we can, say the peace movement one was actually a really great and open, like this exhibition that we're doing as well. Like, I suppose what you write and what you, actually they're just very supportive, to be honest. It's like, we have quite a lot of kind of small socialist trusts in Britain that we apply to, but also we have done things with like different, like the Arts Council as well. Like our youth project is funded by the Arts Council, so there's like a much more of a creative element to that as well. But we always try and bring money that's like core funding back into the organisation where we have these activities that we just do regardless of project funding as well. But I do appreciate that that is a very kind of good position to be in as well. This is maybe, again, from a UK perspective, but I do think like having a space, being able to try and get that space and then having these things like projects that come out of that, if that's like at all attainable, is very useful in trying to like having a continuity that isn't just project to project to project, that like kind of locates that, and then you can sort of do those projects around it, I suppose. I don't know if you found that was Pykë Presje. Like the space in a way becomes a continuity and the organisation outside of just project work. Oh,
I mean, no. Wait. It's not like MayDay Rooms. It's not that scale. It's almost like a private initiative. You know, it is not almost. It is a private initiative. Mostly voluntary. We are now working with Heritage Space. We have a project. It's all arbitrary, random. There is no state support structures that would encourage this, like a public support structures that would encourage this, let's say, initiatives. Not at all. And especially because it is not like a national representation. It's something like, you know, completely based on internationalism and solidarity, like what we want to do, and try to find more critical voices. So yeah. I mean, no, this is here is that is totally unpredictable field. Arbitrary, you know, what would you get? Support would be mostly related to some connections, some, you know, encounters, links. But I say that, of course, we do some serious work we have done with this, you know, which we will present in some other occasions, not now. But and many people in Kosovo actually, and I can see like there is an interest also to engage with archives, you know, to find an ethics in these archives, you know, to find the position, because we have the huge black hole of the socialist period of like 40 years, and what to do with that. That is what is the irony of dealing with archives in Kosovo, is that the most well preserved archives are about the period which is completely denied as an important. And then you have the 90s, 2000s, which you don't have archives, you know? Like, you don't have even the archives about the personal initiatives. So, yeah, because, of course, of the apartheid regime, Kosovo was living through. And then after this very extreme neoliberalism, which is still continuing. So, you know, that is the irony. And from the every project dealing with archives actually has to start with this dialectics, with this question. What is the available? It's not interesting to people. What is interesting to everyone is not there. It's hard to find. So, yeah.
But also, say, MayDay Rooms' collection, a lot of it doesn't get looked at. But it's not like everyone's looking at all of those 100,000 documents. So you can keep it and you can create a body of that and it will become interesting.
what are people interested in?
It really changes depending on what is going on. Yeah, it really does. You can tell what's going on in the world by what people are requesting from the archive. And so at the moment, it is eco-anarchism from the 1990s. Or housing, or because there's a big rental crisis in London, or yeah. So what I mean is that there'll be something that will go out of public consciousness and then it will come back in. And so it doesn't all have to be interesting. In fact, a lot of the stuff we have in MayDay is not interesting. It's, but that's kind of part of it as well. It doesn't have to just be that. Yeah, sure.
It's getting quite cold here, but more questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask something about, I don't know if this is a question of governance, but you make of it what you want to. You mentioned that this is from below, so it's a collective endeavor. It's non-partisan, so very horizontal, non-hierarchical. Now, if anything about archives is that given the fragility that is commonly associated with it, the organization and maintenance of archives is usually thought through institutions or lines that are very much hierarchical, so systematization, filing, preservation, etc. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what kind of challenges, if any, do you encounter in doing this horizontally, non-hierarchical, in a non-hierarchical way, and what are potential pitfalls, for lack of a better word, on. Thank you.
If someone was to give us something really fragile or unique, we wouldn't take it because exactly for that reason. So we're not taking the personal letters of someone from the 1920s. And so I mentioned this archive interference archive. They only take duplicates because they really believe that material needs to be handled. And so we don't have incredibly high preservation needs that you might have in a normal archive. Some of the pitfalls of generally working non-hierarchically is that you can just also remake the wheel again. You can just be someone will be why don't we do this instead? And then you have a discussion about it and you're but we already decided that we were going to do that. So obviously that doesn't come up well with archival systems. But it does mean that everyone can do a bit of everything. So it doesn't become sort of, you're not just an expert in this bit, or you're just doing cataloging, or you're just doing programming, and so the fact that everyone gets involved in events or workshops or working with the archive or digitization, this makes our jobs more interesting as well, because obviously just cataloging is not very interesting. But I think because we don't have this great preservation need, and there's very simple rules, if it was in a folder, it has to remain in a folder, or how it goes back in the box and things like that. But yeah, I think I wouldn't advocate our model to something that's dealing with incredibly rare documents as well. So.
And how does this scannathons, marathons, scanning look like? Can you tell us a little?
Well, it turns out that people really like scanning, which I was actually quite surprised about. We had one where people had travelled from around the country to scan. Yes, it's that big. So you should try it. Here, have a scannathon, see if anyone turns up.
We did a little workshop like that. Do you use a flatbed scanner? So
we also have a copy stand. We had a book scanner that came all the way from Zagreb. We have, sometimes people were doing it on their phones, and we have a very much it's better to have a scan than it to be a good scan, as long as it's readable. Do you know what I mean? So, and we had one scanning session which was based on these newspapers that came out of Northern Ireland, and they mainly chatted, to be fair, and didn't scan. But it turned out that all their parents had been involved in making this newspaper, and this was just a way into the archives.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like doing something else to get into something. You know, when you procrastinate, you have like a different task to get into and something else. And so scanning in a way becomes secondary. It's not like an efficient way of archiving. It's a way of people getting to understand that process and the material.
Right. Nice. Also,
But hi. And you mentioned before your archiving practices, and I was just wondering, do you create records of the way how you archive? Like, for example, how is that evolving, and how if it reflects as well on your archival holdings? Because I'm just also wondering, how do you keep track, or how do you create records of your own institutional memory? It matters who we are, who archives as well, especially from the bottom up, because it's shared authority most of the time. We celebrate that. Especially when you mention the fact that a lot of these decisions are based on discussions. So I'm just wondering, how do you keep track of your own practices? Or do you care at all?
It's a great question, and also a difficult one. So we keep records, we make decisions through minutes. And so we have all of those. So someone did come in once, and someone also wanted to do an ethnography in our office, which we said no, because it would involve them like watching us do, I don't know, make bad jokes or something. But we probably don't do it enough, actually, because it's quite a young organization. It's like, when we moved in 2013 to our building, it was in discussion beforehand. I think the founding members were much more meticulous at documenting this sort of like internal processes. But we've written about it quite a lot. And someone asked before, actually, how we document our own events and workshops as a kind of archival thing. And we don't record them because we think it kind of changes how they work. So we have records of like what they were and like the blurbs and things like that, but we don't actually write down what it, like, we don't do a sort of institutional kind of archiving in that sense. We have a lot of like evolving workflows, but they're very much like DIY in a way, like, this is how you do this is how you do that as well. And then, yeah, we've written, I suppose, about it and like how that's changed and our thinking behind things. But I'm not sure how much it has changed in terms of like, there might be like different approaches to metadata, but in terms of those principles, they remain quite the same in a way. And like, yeah, as it is so sort of ongoing, there's like discussion about how well that's doing as well. Like, but equally, yeah, we are actually quite a small and very part-time organization. So I have to say, it would probably be good if we could do more than that. But a lot of it is trying to like keep it going in a way. But I'll take your point back to the collective.
Rather than questions, maybe just in the other side. What I see that although your organization is not hierarchical, the process is fairly centralized, which means that a lot of people would send to you and you'll do the whole process of archiving and fixing it and everything. Which in the term, I think also guarantees some sort of process and quality and assurance, right? But there is this experience of the centralized model of what Indie Media Athens has, which is sort of an anarchist platform where all the groups have a sort of account there. So each event, each flyer, each poster, each everything was posted in there. But now it's around 20 years that it exists. So now it's a collection of all of those things that happened for 20 years, and it was already digitalized. So this was kind of a good thing that happened, but we have a really huge problem in indexing those. So you cannot search them. You don't know what it is, how it is. It was not categorized properly. through different years, there were different ways that you would upload this with different type of tags. So there's no system to it. But now there's actually an initiative, on Balkan-wide initiative of an anarchist movement to collectively create a new network and non-archive initiative on a Balkan level. But we will see next year, we have a meeting and see how it will actually play it out. But things maybe for groups that are decentralized from different points of sources, with different type of methodologies, what would be your advice of actually how to merge these different tendencies?
So there was a great network that we were in conversation with in Italy called Rebal. I don't know if it's like Anarchist Archive Alliance, where they basically tried to rationalize all the metadata across all the catalogs of all the anarchists' collections in Italy. I don't know how far they've got. I can give you some information about that because that's probably one of the most, they would probably be quite useful. They were called Rebal? Yes. Jacopo. Anyway. So we actually archived Indie Media London after there was some sort of split and someone ran off with one server. And also a problem with but I mean, we advise quite a lot of smaller independent archives as well. We have less of a, like, I suppose if you think about leftovers, anyone can use that and people do upload their own material. You have to kind of get involved with our metadata schema and make it available. But you also don't have to fill in all of the fields, and they're pretty comprehensive. So that's an idea of a shared online platform that makes it much easier in a way, and also relates back to the source, which I think is always important with these small initiatives. We're not particularly focused on cataloging in a way at MayDay Rooms. Like, we do have a catalog, but it's mainly for our internal reference. Like, people don't request it. So we find things like finding aids, like collection descriptions, things that are like descriptions of the material that we have, much more useful for sharing than trying to get really kind of obsessed on a very sort of like standardized cataloging kind of approach, because in a way this is also about archival labor. We don't also have time to catalog all of that, and we think in terms of our approach it's actually better to put that elsewhere. But there is a lot written on different, like, choosing an archival like cataloging standard and then everyone following that, and that's a lot of the work of what bigger archives do as well. Now this one doesn't work like that because we kind of made it up. It's not a standard, it's the platform's metadata that's come out of thinking through those documents. But yeah, I remember when we were archiving Indie Media, the tags were absolutely wild in a way. And you said what? But one of them, which was tagged to every single video, was just oppression, which becomes an unuseful tag, right? Because everyone also has that as well. It's the same with strike here. If you click on strike here, like, I don't know, 10,000 documents come down. It becomes less useful for that as well. But I found, like, because this work is like a lot of work to do, which I'm sure you like appreciate, we can't collect everything, we can't catalog everything. So I think working with smaller archives and forming exactly these kind of networks actually can really be super helpful in like sharing that knowledge, even if it's not sharing that catalog. But are you talking about an online presence, or are you talking about a federation of catalogs, or
is it printed matter you're talking?
Or video?
So I think actually the most of these were done like because they were like public digital things, like people would post flyers and post declarations and post the events. That was all already digital. Like, it is not an actual catalog that would also archive also other people that they don't upload. Like, if it's a flyer that doesn't necessarily have to be online, people would not put it there. Mm-hmm. But now there's this initiative from 3 different places in Europe, in Balkans, that they want to actually collect from everything, and we gotta probably send a delegate from each of the country to add our own materials to it.
Okay.
But we still had not figured out what to do or how to do. And I think it's an interesting moment to meet,
Yeah.
Because you would also, maybe your experience dollars of, should it be a standardized type of procedure to do it, or a description that would just maybe say it and it would be indexed in such a way and could be searchable. I don't know. Maybe AI could help us in defining those type of things. Thinking out loud.
I don't know if, sorry to put you on the spot. One of my best pieces of advice of doing all of these kind of digital archives and all this sort of stuff is that you need to make friends with a very good programmer. This is he's a magician. He's like an archival database magician. And so I think those questions of how you kind of understand that data as well, if it's already digitized, can be super useful. As we wouldn't have been able to do any of that without that kind of help as well. So, yeah, space and a programmer, and like a physical space and a programmer, and you're set in the archive.
Jeez. Okay, we are finishing soon, and you open a little bit people for some few minutes, or if you have more times to look at these documents, I think people would like to touch. About anarchist archives, I think in London there is Info 56A.
56A Info Shop.
Very interesting initiative building the anarchist, the publications archive on their own independent. So yeah, thanks, Rosemary. This was really interesting,
Thank you very much.
And yeah, please come and have a look at the material, book, posters. You can take the posters, in fact.
Yeah,
but there's not that many.
For taking, yeah.